Hello, everybody. Welcome to the immigration panel. My name is Manu Raju. I am a reporter for Politico. I cover Congress for Politico, and one of the subjects that I've been covering recently is immigration. So very timely with the bill now moving through Congress and being debated on the Senate floor this week. And I'm going to introduce our distinguished panel here, and then we'll begin our discussion. First, Clarissa Martinez de Castro, sitting next to me here, the Director of Civic Engagement and Immigration for the National Council of La Raza. At the the NCLR, she oversees the organization's work to advance fair and effective immigration policies and efforts to expand Latino policy advocacy and electoral participation. And she previously managed NCLR's state-based advocacy work in California and Texas and launched NCLR's Civic Engagement Service Provider Program. Prior to NCLR, she served as the Assistant Director of USC's California-Mexico Project, organizer for the Ladies Garment Workers Union, and union representative for HERE Local 11. A naturalized U.S. citizen, she's a graduate of Occidental College and Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. And next to her is David Martin. David is the Warner Booker Distinguished Professor of International Law at the University of Virginia, where he's been a member of the faculty since 1980. He has published numerous books, scholarly articles, and op-ed essays on immigration, refugees, constitutional law, and international law, including a leading casebook on immigration and citizenship law. As Principal Deputy General Counsel of the Department of Homeland Security from January 2009 to December 2010, and in earlier government service at the Department of State and Department of Justice. He was closely involved in the critical and legal and policy developments in the immigration field. He has also served as the Homeland Security Department's representative on the Interdepartmental Task Force created by President Obama's executive orders for evaluating the cases of all detainees at Guantanamo Bay. And next to David is Sarita Gupta. She is the Executive Director for Jobs with Justice. She is also the co-director of Caring Across the Generations campaign. Ms. Gupta began organizing as a student on campus and was elected president of the U.S. Student Association in 1997 through 98. She has 15 years of local, national, and global coalition building experience through her time at Chicago JWJ and National JWJ. And she has a long history of organizing at the intersections of workers' rights, immigrants' rights, racial justice, and women's rights issues and movements. And last but certainly not least is Alex Norsta. He's the immigration policy analyst at the Cato Institute. Previously, he was an immigration policy analyst at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. He's had op-eds that have appeared in newspapers across the country. His peer-reviewed academic publications have appeared in the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization. He's appeared on Fox News, Bloomberg, Univision, and numerous television and radio stations across the U.S. He's received his BA in economics from George Mason and MSc in economic history from the London School of Economics. So with that, we will begin our discussion. I kind of wanted to start off with talking about how we got here, and I'll start off with you, Dave. If you could kind of give the audience sort of a lay of the land of, you talk about some of the key moments that have brought this debate to where it is today on the Senate floor, and and even compare it to the 2007 fight that led to its failure in the Senate.
Okay, I'd be glad to do that. This issue obviously has been around for a long time in discussions of comprehensive immigration reform since the very early days of the George W. Bush administration. It was stalled out for a while as we dealt with September 11th. Major push again from 2005 to 2007. The McCain-Kennedy bill, and then an effort at a grand compromise with a somewhat tougher bill in 2007 that obviously did not succeed. President Obama made certain pledges about pressing for comprehensive immigration reform. during the 2008 campaign, and then he was widely criticized for failing to deliver on that during the first term. But I think it turns out that, as you may remember, the legislative agenda was really quite crowded. Some of those early pledges were made before the economy crashed. We had to deal with economic measures, a stimulus bill. Healthcare took a lot longer than was expected. There were a number of other measures that were underway at that time. But the main thing I want to emphasize is it's not as though, although a lot of people said this, oh, he did nothing about it. A lot was done. I was involved in that. We worked very hard on major drafts, developing ideas, thinking hard about the issues, trying to position policy, administrative policy along the way in ways that would make it more possible for a bill to succeed. But the president made it very clear, it became clear to us as we worked on it, that he did not want just a kind of noble effort that would go down in flames. He wanted to bring it forward under circumstances that would likely be successful. And now we have, let me just mention very quickly, 4 factors, I think, that make the current moment much more auspicious than one might have expected, certainly far more than 2009 to 2010. And there's a lot of factors that could be mentioned, and I'm painting with a broad brush, but I'll mention 4 of them in particular. And these are 4 measures that not only make it reasonably favorable context for passage, but also for implementation of a vast new reform regime that touches a lot of different aspects of migration management. We need not only to get a bill, we need to get a bill in a form that can be implemented and then to implement it well. First reason, I think, why it's a lot more auspicious now is we've now had several years of net zero undocumented migration to this country. And it's not a very admirable trait, but I think it's true of a great many human communities, not just in the United States. When a lot of newcomers come to a town, a community, particularly if they haven't had much experience with foreigners living there in the past, the signs change over to a different language, they're more resistant. And there was major inflow in the mid-2000s that made for fertile ground for those who wanted to defeat the bill, wanted to build up a major grassroots effort. And again, we talked to Senate offices in 2009. They talked about the barrage of phone calls that they received in 2006 and 2007. That's stabilized some. And it turns out that a lot of people have gotten used to the idea of the folks who live there. They've gotten to know some of them through their kids, through their schools, through the churches, through the workplace. It's not nearly the kind of environment that we had when the numbers were increasing. A stable situation like that is favorable. And a lot of that, of course, came from the economic crash, but I think it's not only that. I think it's also that enforcement deployments have an effect that mean that when the economy improves, we won't go back to the situation we had before. And more importantly than that, there's some very significant economic and demographic developments in Mexico that I think mean that the migration pressures will be a lot less in the coming years and therefore augurs well for implementation. Second factor, USCIS, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, the adjudication and benefits granting agency, was mired in bad backlogs in 2006 to 2007. They've overcome those. There have been a lot of improvements at USCIS. I could say a lot more about it. I won't, but it's just that agency is in a much better position now to take on a legalization program that may have 10 or 11 million applicants and also make major changes in legal migration. A third factor, it's an important anniversary today, is DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, administrative measures for the so-called Dreamers, people who would have been covered by the DREAM Act. It's a much limited set of opportunities that are given by DACA than would be in a DREAM Act. But it was 1 year ago today that Secretary Napolitano announced that the people who were working on that, it was a very small circle before it was announced, were not sure how that would be received. And it turned out they were worried that it might be a big issue in the campaign. Turned out, thankfully, I'm proud of our country, it was pretty well received. The polling quickly showed a 2-to-1 support for that. It did not become a major campaign issue, and I think that opened up some political space and space in our thinking to talk a little more openly about legalization for a wider circle of people. And the final factor I'll mention, which may be a bit provocative or counterintuitive, was the Obama administration's enforcement record. You hear a lot of criticism from both sides on that. There's talk about record deportations, but I think some of the people who are critical of the deportation record need to think hard about what it would mean if a president simply came in and said, well, I don't agree with the law, and although Congress has appropriated a lot of money for enforcement, I'm simply not going to deploy that. That would be a very dangerous precedent. A future Republican president could come in and say, well, I don't agree with this level of environmental enforcement, or I don't agree with the Consumer Finance Protection Board, and simply cut it back. What the administration tried to do was to say, well, we accept, I mean, it's happened. It's been with Republican and Democratic support that those high enforcement budgets have been enacted. People haven't really focused on changing that if they don't like the level of enforcement. What happened instead was to try to direct that towards smarter enforcement, more focused on sound priorities. And that actually was a key reason why I would maintain, although there's now one court decision against it, DACA was fully legal. It was not an effort to say we're going to do less enforcement, although Congress has appropriated something. It's saying we're doing other enforcement. We're sustaining an enforcement effort, but we are going to be smart about who it is that we're going to direct it toward. And I think beyond that, although again, there's a lot of criticism on various sides, it's created a little more room for making the case with those who are in the middle, kind of undecided, that it's an administration that will be serious about enforcement and can be trusted with a new set of changes. So we need, but the main thing we do need a bill and an implementation effort that is careful about both sides of it. It's not just a matter of legalizing populations who've become an important part of our communities over many years, although that is a very important part of the bill. It's also about creating a circumstance, a situation, a new culture of compliance, a new focus on enforcement so we don't get into the same situation a few years down the road. And I hope I'll have a chance to say a little bit more about that, because I'm a little worried that well, I'd like to see some changes in the bill, a little more careful, thoughtful effort on enforcement to have that full kind of balance. And last thing I'll say is the talk there is all about border security, border security. That's not really where the main focus needs to be. If we want a regime on the far side of legalization that is manageable and enforceable, the main places to focus are on interior enforcement, straightforward interior enforcement as well as E-Verify, and we need to pay close attention to that.
And we'll definitely get into the enforcement aspect of it in a little bit. Clarissa, if you could kind of lay out some of the main sticking points here, you know, as we get into a very critical moment on the Senate floor when there are going to be key votes. What do you see as some of the main sticking points that will need to be resolved in order to get this bill out of the Senate?
Well, there's a couple of things, and I think that anybody who's been reading the papers knows what the flanks of that debate and conversation are. But before I go there, because it bears on what is the discussion on what's going on right now and what needs to be resolved. I would like to say that, you know, I find the four defining moments you presented very interesting because, you know, from where I sit, I know, sadly, not because I like it, that these kinds of debates are, and the policy that comes from them has as much to do with politics as with substance, right? And so that's part of what's permeating this debate and part of why border enforcement has become such a lightning rod. It's kind of like this easy default position that everybody goes through. And the interesting thing to me is that while President Obama has an incredibly strong record of deportations, the nature of which we've been pretty vocal critics of, the reality is that in the Republican side, the strategy of him getting credit and traction with Republicans is just completely absent, right? If you look at the discussion on border enforcement and what needs to happen, it is all predicated on the narrative that this administration has not enforced the law at all, never mind that there's 1,000 people being deported every day, right? So, as you know, that's kind of the nature of the game. It's not just on immigration, but immigration definitely is a fact-free zone. I wish that at least we could depart from the facts, even if people have different analysis, interpretation about where they lead you. But the reality is that, you can read any statement coming from some of the folks who are talking mostly about border security, but it is predicated on this administration has failed to enforce the law, which of course, some of us in our communities know it's not true at all. And obviously, the other thing that was very important to create this moment was completely political, and that was, in many ways, Latinos gave face to it, but Asian voters are also an important part of that equation, and that is purely political. It's about the electorate, right? And the fact that Republicans saw that if they continue on this path, they will never see the inside of the White House. And I think that particularly when you talk about the Senate, where you have 100 people that in one way or another think they're going to be president, that is a very compelling narrative. And we saw that immediate effect, right? That renewal of conversations, the uptick started right after the election. So I would say the 2012 election was a defining moment, not only in terms of crystallizing the political imperative for reform. Up until then, the moral imperative, I think groups in the religious side, the social justice, the civil rights community, the pro-immigrant community have been painting that picture. But moral imperatives sadly don't get you there either. I think that the economic imperative started crystallizing even more between 2010 and 2012, when the handful of states that decided to implement 1070 and copycats, you started seeing actually economic impact out of that. And I think that a lot of folks in the business community who had not put as much skin in the game started seeing the consequences of where that was going, and states pushing for their own E-Verify or their own employer provisions and those kinds of things. And then you also start seeing employers who had been able to tinker with the immigration system to meet their needs by altering visa programs and deal with that part of the world in isolation, being less and less able to do that, and therefore seeing that, doing comprehensive was the way that they were going to try to fix whether the high-tech visa levels and all that stuff. So then you start having the economic imperative crystallizing a little better, and then the political imperative, right? Because I think that, again, sadly, I don't think the president has gotten credit on the deportation regime that he has in fact put in place. We wish he had, right? Because it has definitely created a lot of pain. Anyway, so where are we now? The reason that's important, again, is because it's about where politics and policy meet, and it is absolutely right. The conversation in the Senate has been in large part dominated on the border piece. And I think that this is not news to anybody. There's a wide sense that, Mr. Cornyn, who also has a very strong track record of saying things very convincingly, but always finding a reason to defeat efforts on immigration, whether it's DREAM Act, whether it is immigration reform, anything like that, sort of was able to get ahead of the group of eight, the Gang of Eight, and kind of start giving definition to what an acceptable border package may be like, which is hardly problematic because nobody is sure that even if you did those things, which would probably start losing you votes on the other side, you would actually get his votes. But nevertheless, it indicates, right? And if you go talk to a lot of these offices, it's fascinating. It doesn't matter which office you talk to. It can be the most landlocked, lowest immigrant population state, and the first thing people say is border security. We need to address border security, and it needs to be stronger. So that's going to need to happen. Whatever agreement they're able to deal has to happen this week for procedural and momentum reasons on the bill. So I think we're probably going to see some efforts to tighten up the border provisions and triggers.
Ask you on that. I mean, how far is too far for you on the border, going on these changes? Because if there are going to have to be changes on the border, when you look at that, what would be too far for you when these guys look at changing the bill?
Well, for us, we made it very clear what our guiding light is. We've been involved in the conversations in all of the different pieces on the worker side and on the border provisions, but definitely in the family provisions. But the guiding light for us is we need to have a legalization program. The amount of pain and tragedy that the current deportation regime and enforcement regime is creating, it's not good from a social perspective, from a community perspective, but we also think that part of what's happening in this debate is that the enforcement-only flank has really hijacked the law and order message. And we strongly believe that in order to restore the rule of law, you cannot restore it doing enforcement without doing legalization. And, legalization allows you to get otherwise law-abiding people, remove them from the stack so that if you're trying to find the needles in the haystack that threaten public safety and national security, you can focus on those better. So I think Senator Menendez has spoken quite eloquently about this. Any triggers that are an excuse to delay the registration of eligible immigrants into that provisional status and that tinker what is already an extremely harsh and narrow path, that starts going very far, because then it starts making the legalization piece, which again, from a humane perspective is very important for us, but it's also a very important piece of reestablishing the rule of law, then you start throwing more and more people out of that path.
And quickly, this Republican alternative there's a Republican alternative being drafted to this Cornyn provision, Cornyn amendment. Have you seen that, and do you have a sense that does it do those things that you're concerned about?
I think there are discussions underway right now. I don't think that they have landed yet. And I think people expect that, between Tuesday and Wednesday next week, this is going to dominate the conversation on the floor. And then the other flank, which goes again to what is, I equate this 10-year provisional period. We are asking people to hold their breath for 10 years, right? So partly is that initial step of moving to the registered provisional status, immigrant status, RPI, which removes the threat of deportation from people who are otherwise law-abiding. And then the second very important piece is that at the 10-year mark, when people are able to apply for legal permanent resident, where they at least are able to take a breath, right? So making that path longer, considering how harsh it is, it's extremely problematic, because then depending how you tinker with that, you end up with a legalization and, yes, a roadmap to citizenship, which starts being a shell of itself.
Okay, thank you. And Sarita, if I could bring you in here, one of the things that we haven't really gotten into yet, but is also a very critical aspect, is the coalition that's formed around it and the support within the labor community for this proposal. Back in '07, of course, labor was not happy with the guest worker provision, and that dispute was one of the reasons why the bill didn't succeed. How different is this time versus last time from labor's perspective? And if you could give a sense on how it affects labor as well, that'd be great.
Sure. So let me just start by saying immigration is a core labor issue, right? People come to this country to work, or people come with other people who are here to work, right? So at the heart of it, what we've recognized from a workers' rights labor perspective is that there's just an enormous disconnect between people who are coming to work and our current employment system. So whether that's what are the pathways for workers to come into this country, have legal work authorization, green cards, guest worker visas, et cetera. But we also know they haven't been adequate enough, which is why we do have a large number of unauthorized workers in the US. So from a labor perspective, we recognize that flow of workers will happen, right? It's global labor migration is happening. We are one piece of that system, and so flow will happen, and that what we need is a system that recognizes the flow and really brings workers out of the shadows of our economy. So without that, I think most people in this room know, without that, what we've witnessed is huge vulnerability of immigrant workers. The creation from employers who want to take advantage of that, of substandard jobs, workers who are being grossly underpaid or in many respects experiencing wage theft. We see more and more immigrant workers in unsafe working conditions, with very little avenue to pursue labor and civil rights complaints against law-breaking employers. And then when workers do, immigrant workers actually do speak up and talk about the conditions in their workplaces, they're threatened with deportation and other forms of retaliation, right? So what that means is that workers are being silenced, and it means that they have to accept really unjust and diminishing working conditions. And this has impact on all workers, not just immigrant workers, but all workers in the U.S. So if we understand there's this increase of global labor migration, what we've seen from the past is that every legislative push has resulted in a reduction of rights, but an increase in the number of workers who are allowed to come in. And so what we're trying to do in this round of immigration reform is say, actually, we should ensure that workers have the right to earn the wage workers were promised, that workers should have the right to change jobs, that workers should have the right to basic labor standards and protections, and that workers should have the ability to stay in the country if they want to. So obviously, what I'm talking about is the future flow issue, and I think the W visa program is actually a huge step forward in that regard. This new employment-based visa program really, would determine the actual need for foreign labor with labor market data and affords the foreign workers with basic rights like job portability and an ability to petition for citizenship if they choose to, right? So this was obviously based on the negotiations between the AFL-CIO and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. So those are all, those are, I think, positive steps that feel very different in the debate today. But I also want to talk for a second about, for current workers who are already in the United States, so the 7 million or 7.5 million who are in the current labor market, I think some of the positives that we see is obviously that for many of you in this room will appreciate the Hoffman Plastics fix, right? But the idea of overturning the 2002 Supreme Court decision to make clear that nothing in immigration law prohibits the National Labor Relations Board from awarding back pay to undocumented workers. Another sort of arena has been labor protections that have so far been in the bills that we're excited about and have worked hard to make sure happen, but provisions like POWER, which is protecting our workers against exploitation and retaliation that Senator Menendez and on the House side, Representative Chu have introduced as separate bills, but then have been integrated into the immigration bills we see now. But this would essentially provide whistleblower protections for workers who seek to enforce workplace rights for themselves and their coworkers. We've talked about E-Verify being another sort of provision that's in the bills. I will just say for a second, wearing my Caring Across Generations hat, that there is an area of concern around E-Verify, which is really about the fact that everybody, including individual employers, home-based employers will be mandated to do E-Verify. So what we're hearing is a lot of the aging community, disability rights communities, folks who depend on home health care are very nervous about what this means. Like, how will this get enacted? What tools are they going to be given? So I think there's a lot still there to be figured out. And just to say, I think we still feel nervous about some key roadblocks for low-wage workers. One is, Clarissa was just talking about the RPI status, and then after a certain number of years, you're able to take a breath. What we're nervous about is that some of the most vulnerable low-wage workers actually won't have the opportunity to take a breath, meaning day laborers, workers like domestic workers, and others who, for them, if you can imagine, these are workers who are really in the shadows, if you will. And, day laborers are some of the most public images. When we think about unauthorized workers, people think about the men who are gathered at the corners. So that's the most public image. And the most private image is the workers who are in homes taking care of people, our children, our aging adult, our loved ones. They're the sort of private image of what's at stake here. And in both, having to prove employment is going to be really tricky. So I think we have huge, huge concerns about what that will look like and mean moving forward. There's a ton of fees and penalties to be on this pathway that I think we're very worried about. You know, $500 penalty at the first step and another $500 at the 6 year, and then $1,000 beyond. So I think there's just fees and penalty questions. And then a reality that any felony excludes people from the pathway, which for many low-wage workers who have been on the corners, for example, there's a ton of examples of where there have been really minimal issues that have caused the criminalization of low-wage workers that now mean they may be excluded from the very pathway that we need them to be on. And I think another area we're nervous about is some of the provisions around civics and English that we're not really sure there's actually even enough capacity for the kinds of ESL classes and things to meet those needs of a lot of low-wage workers, immigrant workers, to be able to be on the path. So those are a few of the things, you know, I would name. I hope in the conversation we can talk about more, but I just want to end by saying, you know, what's really promising to me and what feels very different from the last round is more of labor has come together and embraced we need a pathway to citizenship. This is important for all 11 million. We need a pathway to citizenship. This is critical. We need to make sure there are these protections in place, but I think it's huge that that embracing has happened. You know, there's still a ton of concerns about existing guest worker programs. I think are still individual unions are working out, but people have embraced the bigger eye on the prize, which is really the pathway to citizenship. And the other thing is that more and more worker centers or low-wage workers who have really organized themselves at the community level have really built up their capacities and ability to really articulate the needs of low-wage workers, low-wage immigrant workers, and really come together with labor and broader immigrant rights communities to figure out positive solutions. So I think there's a lot of momentum.
And you feel that's on the grassroots level in addition to Washington?
That's right.
Oh, yeah.
So incredibly thoughtful and creative advocacy, you know, that's happening. I mean, when you look at domestic workers who said, we can't just be domestic workers out here alone, let's engage the women's movement and help women or help the aging community or help the disability rights community understand why it's in their interest to be a part of this debate around immigration reform. A lot of consumers of care who depend on immigrant workforces in their homes have a stake in this. So just expanding the debate also to include the multiple voices that really need to be a part of the debate is actually some of the most exciting things that I see happening right now.
Thanks. Alex, I'll turn to you. Lay out some of the economics of this debate. You know, on Monday, we're expected to get at least some official cost estimates from the Congressional Budget Office. You know, there have been a lot of numbers thrown around. Some critics have pegged that this could cost in the trillions for federal, you know, once you legalize the 11 million and they're starting to get benefits in the long run. Well, give us a sense from your perspective how this would, if this becomes law, how this would affect the economy and the impact that this would have on the federal government's budget.
Yeah, thank you. I also just want to say to begin with, it's not common that a person from the Cato Institute is invited to speak at an ACS conference, so I'm very happy to be here today to speak to you all about this issue. The economics, I think, are pretty simple. If you have more people who are workers who contribute to the economy, then that grows the size of GDP. That increases the amount of things that are able to be made in the United States, the amount of services able to be provided, and that ultimately is a test of whether you are wealthy or not. So what we see with immigration is we are literally adding factors of production to the country. We are literally adding workers, entrepreneurs, and as a result, we are seeing the size of the economy increase. Now, I think the particular study you were referencing was one produced by Robert Rector and Jason Richwine from the Heritage Foundation. They did a study where they said that the cost of what they called amnesty, of the legalization program, would be a net $6.3 trillion fiscal loss for the U.S. government over a 50-year period of time. Now, I don't know if this has ever happened before, but I wrote something called a prebuttal. So I got some information about their study coming out about a month before it came out, indication that they were remaking the study. And this is basically an updated version of one they did in 2007, which had a big impact in killing that debate, killing the reform effort back then. It was one of many things. And it's one of the worst studies that I've ever read in terms of just its methodology. So just in the way that they calculated these issues, it was incredibly amateurish. Just to give you an example, if I'm going to estimate the cost of something over a long period, like 50-year time period, I need to employ something called a discount rate and discount it to the present if I'm going to talk about something. So I need to do a net present value calculation, which means, because if it costs $6 trillion, well, that doesn't mean it costs $6 trillion today, because I can put some amount of money in a bank account or an interest, and then that will become $6.3 trillion. So it's dishonest for me to say that. So it turns out if you do a 3% discount rate, which is what the CBO does, it lowers that number by 78%. Just off the bat, just doing adult math lowers that number by 78%. Another problem with this is I am a huge fan of something called dynamic scoring. It's the idea that legislation will impact the economy. So if we want to estimate what the future impacts will be, we need to take into account that effect on the economy. Now, the most obvious thing is tax increases. If I double tax rates, I'm not going to get double the amount of tax revenue, because people are going to change their behavior. They're not going to work as much. They're not going to invest as much. They're going to stay home on the weekends, etc. That's something that the Heritage Foundation has been talking about for like 30 years. It influenced me as a young man when I was learning about economics, because it makes so much sense. Well, they didn't do that for this paper. They didn't estimate that having more people here lawfully will increase the size of GDP and economic growth. Even more disturbing is they assumed that forcing all these people out of the country, forcing 11.5 million people and roughly 9-ish million workers out of the country would have zero impact on GDP, which was what their preferred policy was. We did a study at Cato 2 years ago. We hired Professor Raul Hinojosa Ojeda from UCLA, who has training in economics, to run a model. He estimated that the economic cost of GDP of doing that over a 10-year period is about $2.6 trillion in lost growth. Now, I think having a GDP of $2.6 trillion lower than it otherwise would have been decreases tax revenue, all else remaining equal. But, call me crazy. I'm only a published economist. What do I know? But so it's really this thing where we saw every single right-of-center, free market, libertarian group in D.C., with the exception of the Heritage Foundation, come out against this report. And they came out against it rapidly and immediately. Everything from the Hudson Institute to the Competitive Enterprise Institute, Americans for Tax Reform, Grover Norquist Group, every group down the line, former economists working for the Bush administration, Republican administrations, slammed this report from the get-go because of its faulty methods and methodology. And I think that is a good sign to see going forward.
Why do you think that the opposition on the right this time is really divided, or the right is divided over this? What's your sense of that?
I think it's part of a sort of, I think it's, from Cato, I might be biased about this, but I think the right is becoming more libertarian in the way it views everything from some social issues to economics in particular. We see, and we also have sort of a tradition of this. A lot of people, look back on the right, look back to Ronald Reagan and these guys for a lot of inspiration. But when you listen to someone like Ronald Reagan or Jack Kemp or these other sort of older school Republicans in the 80s or 90s talk about immigration, they're practically in favor of open borders, an open borders policy. You hear somebody like Paul Ryan, who really grew up in that kind of, that school of economics and that school of radical free market economics, and there's no reason. These people are free traders all the way. They believe in free flow of capital. They don't like taxation regulations on the labor market and minimum wages. So why would you want to restrict the flow of labor or people to more to opportunities? I mean, it's just the logical continuation of this, and it's sort of a go back to home movement or a back to Jesus moment with some people on the right who are sort of trying to get in touch with the free market aspects of their own ideology.
Thanks. Dave, if I could bring it back to, let's just say that, all these hurdles that you guys all laid out somehow become, they overcome these, they get up to the Senate, the House passes its bill, they conference it, it gets approved, signed by the president sometime this year. What does the post-enactment world look like in your eyes, and what are some of the shortcomings that would presumably have to be resolved again by future Congresses? And could this be the subject of litigation, the way we've seen in other major laws like Obamacare?
It definitely could. I'll go into that, but part of it, I think, also about the post-enactment world has to do with some of the things that Alex mentioned. I get a little bit nervous when there's such broad support on the right for some of these things, an almost open borders world. It's not just because it's going to bring in vast new, I mean, I do think that immigration can definitely promote our economy, but it's really important to pay attention to who gets most of the benefit from that kind of improvement. Broad guest worker programs, widespread opportunities for people to immigrate is not necessarily good for workers in our society. And these are very complicated issues. I don't want to see us go back to really restrictive immigration. I'm glad that labor and business have found ways to find compromises, but I worry a lot about those. And there are some studies that tend to indicate that, yes, there is additional economic benefit that's generated by immigration. Most of that is claimed, advantages claimed by the immigrants themselves, which is fine. That's their work. What's left, though, disproportionately, some of the studies seem to indicate, disproportionately flows to the businesses at the expense of some of the existing workers. So it's really important to pay a lot of attention to exactly how we design those. I'm skeptical of broad guest worker programs. If we need more, particularly on the lower skilled side, if we need more lower skilled workers, maybe it would make sense to allow them to come in as permanent residents and have complete freedom to move around in the labor market. We're trying to create something sort of like that with regard to the W visa, but it's very complicated. Well, I think the preference for guest workers sometimes reflects just the fact that even the best designed guest worker program does give a lot of leverage to employers in a way that doesn't happen with permanent immigration. And it's ironic to me, the latest manifestation of this was in Jeb Bush and Clint Bolick's book. They've backed off from a lot of that, but they wanted to shift a lot of migration away from families because why? Because they're low skilled and they're not contributing much to the economy over into the employment categories, but at the same time create guest worker programs for getting lower skilled people here. If we need more lower skilled people, why not have them come with a family structure already in place? And there are some interesting studies. There's a very interesting recent paper by Alan Hyde of Rutgers that shows how the ways that the really broadly overlooked ways in which family migration contributes significantly to economic success. So I invite your attention to that. Now, post-legalization world, if it works as envisioned, we should clear out most of the cases of people who have been here for a long period of time and have ties to the community. We haven't really focused enough on what that would look like then. That would mean, and enforcement resources are not going to go down. There'll be a much smaller pool of people against whom enforcement resources will be directed. They will have less sympathetic claims. And enforcement can be, I think it's a setting in which you won't find the same resistance to enforcement measures that we've seen in communities generally, and from some in the law enforcement community, and particularly from judges who have sometimes engaged in creative interpretations, let me put it that way, to find a favorable result for an individual who really presents a very sympathetic case. Now in that way, I think legalization, and this echoes a little bit of what Clarissa said, but with a different spin on it, legalization, to postpone legalization until we have enforcement in place is the wrong way to go about it. Legalization, rightly done, can fortify smart enforcement, effective enforcement that, if enforcement to be effective, I've been in this business for a long time and also studied it from the outside. There's huge resistance when you're trying to enforce the law against someone who has no violations other than immigration violations and has lots of connections over many years to the country. But then what we need is a nimble system on the far end that can actually move pretty promptly against others. So one example I would give of that, of just where it's misdirected, and some of the current debate is misdirected. There's enormous interest in a biometric exit system. This is the way we're finally going to deal with the overstay problem. Well, I think we should deal with the overstay problem, but that's a system that's not necessarily bad. It would be nice to have, but it's vastly expensive to build the infrastructure to do biometric monitoring of people who are leaving. We already have surprisingly good information on most people who come into the country, biographically, not biometrically. So we can get a very good idea of people who should have left in a certain period of time and they haven't left. This is through collecting information on airplane manifests, ship manifests, and others, documentation that's collected in other sorts of ways, we can get a good idea. If we really want to do something about overstays, the point is not to have ideal, perfect biometric information. The question is, what are you going to do with that information?
Right.
And to have a biometric proof that a person didn't leave at a particular period of time, it's like, well, okay, and now what, Senator? Where is that person? You're not proposing, thank goodness, to have some sort of biometric tracking system that keeps track of where everybody is at every minute. You know that the person
Not
is
yet.
still, the person is still in the United States. So what we ought to be doing, if we're serious about that, we ought to be focusing on that and having a way to move promptly. This is post-legalization, people who come in after enactment of the law, to be able to move promptly against someone who overstays, and to use expend the resources, not to create this expensive new system, use the resources to empower more agents who would go and find the people. And the thing that's important about that to me is, if we did that for a while, I think it would send a very different message to people who come as tourists, as students, and others who kind of take it casually, oh, they don't care very much if I overstay. They'd get the message. We're serious about it. We'll move ahead. It probably means that we ought to think about some kind of a more expeditious removal proceeding with regard to overstays. An overstay violation is pretty easy to prove. It should definitely have safeguards for people who are asylum claimants and maybe an applicant for a TNU visa, but we have some models for how we could do that. I'd like to see something more like that, such as we have for the visa waiver program right now, and show we're serious about that. And then similarly with E-Verify, the key vulnerability of E-Verify is identity fraud, identity borrowing or identity fraud. There's some measures in the bill to address that, but it's really important that we get that part right, because if we come out 5 years from now, we've got E-Verify implemented, and it's easily defeated because entrepreneurs can find a real identity, a name and a number that match up, then, and it's defeated, it would be sort of the I-9 process at a much higher tech level, but not equally effective. I think there are ways we can do that, but I would like to see the bill address it.
Alex, you wanted to respond?
Yeah, I do want to respond. The choice is not between whether we have immigration exactly as we want. The choice is not that we can have immigration exactly as we want it. We are very limited in what we can do in terms of regulating this system. If we could do all these things, we would have already done them. It's very difficult. We have an enormous number of unlawful immigrants in the United States, and I would argue that the reason is not because we've shortchanged internal enforcement or anything else like that, but it's because the wage differences between working in other countries and working here are gigantic. To give you an example, a Bangladeshi who comes here and works for just 3 weeks has already made more money than he could make for years working in Bangladesh. The wage pressures are gigantic. What's furthermore is the evidence of the effectiveness of internal enforcement programs in disincentivizing unlawful immigrants to come to certain places is nil. There's zero evidence of that being effective. Ted Alden at the Council on Foreign Relations has done an enormous amount of work. What we've noticed in places like Arizona that have E-Verify programs, and of course they're not perfect and they're probably going to be unfortunately made more stringent in this bill, is you see people move even deeper into the black market. So instead of filling out any kind of paperwork or going through any kind of I-9 check or going through any kind of E-Verify, they work entirely off the books. I think a lot of times when we talk about legislation, we underestimate the ability of people, especially people who are poor and want higher incomes, what they will do to get around the system. And I think we need to recognize our limitations in doing that. Now, if we want to talk about future flow problems in the United States, I've written a lot about guest workers programs. I've written a lot about unlimited numbers of green cards for low-skilled workers, and you see a lot of support for people on the right, not just for guest workers, but for allowing these people to stay for an enormous amount of time, to be on a path to citizenship eventually, for green cards or some sort of in-between type system. But, and I think, we reveal some of these tensions between organized labor and between sort of a future flow, and there is a lot of tension there. I mean, there's a lot of tension in the past.
Yep.
I mean, but the notion that because we try very hard to protect the jobs of some Americans in some unions, what we will end up doing by creating a complicated guest worker visa that, say, limits the number of immigrants who can go into construction is to perpetuate and to create a black market going forward. Because I don't think that we can underestimate the ability of, just to give you an example, the wage differences between a similarly educated Mexican and an American, it's about a factor of 4 coming here. Now, for Central America, it's about a factor of 6. For a place like Haiti, it's a factor of 13. Now, do you really think that somehow, all of a sudden, more internal enforcement is going to cut this stuff off dramatically, these enormous gains to migration? I'm very skeptical of the government's ability to do that, and I think we need to recognize that by trying to liberalize future flows as much as possible, either through some sort of guest worker visa program that's portable, that's mobile, so workers can move to that without any kind of restrictions, without sort of the restrictions built into the W visa. And that's sort of the main push that we're trying to do at Cato and some other places.
I'll actually let Claire to respond, and then Dave wants to respond too.
Yeah, I think, Alex and David touched on some very important points, and I think there's a convergence there. The main thing is, given the environment and given how politics affect policy, this is about finding the balance that it's gonna get you to a solution. And Alex is right, this is not like what any one of us would think is the right approach or the perfect approach to the problem, but I think it's about trying to stop the bleeding in many different ways and many different sectors and trying to find the best forward. I do agree with Alex and there's been a lot of conversation about we don't want to repeat the mistakes of '86, right? And we legalized 2.7 million people, and now we have 11, as establishing causality between those two things. The reality is that, yes, I don't think enforcement was as smart as it could have been, and frankly, it was more of a wink and a nod system. But ultimately and fundamentally for me, where I go in Alex's direction is that when you have people who are willing to risk their lives in the process of getting here, right? The fact that you are saying, oh, we're not going to let them get a driver's license, or we're going to put more agents on the border, or we're going to do this and the other. I mean, it's just not evenly matched. The reality is that if more people, the majority of those folks are interested in coming here to work, one of the biggest problems we've had is a dysfunctional legal immigration system. Yet the focus is all on border, it's all on the undocumented population, but a root cause of this is a badly structured legal immigration system that is not responding to the economic needs or the social needs, right, of families coming together and all of that. So again, on that plane is about what is the balance that would work. We also don't want to create a situation where employers are simply able to have an open door policy, regardless of what effects it may have on you as workers. But at the same time, if the line for legal workers to stand in is fake, if it's obstructed, if it's too small, then you remove the disincentives for legal immigration. I think that if you have a worker who wants to come here and it's faced with, do I risk my life to try to come in with a smuggler, or this line is really working and it may take 2 years, but I will be there alive and legally, then that starts shifting the balance for the decision. And that's where we as an organization who works on a lot of other issues, not just immigration, and who is looking at our community, 75% whom is made up of Latino US citizens, right? And we look at the interplay of the immigration issue with the employment issue and are somewhere in the middle of these positions. The legal immigration system has to be real and it has to be functional for it to create the incentives for legality in the future. And if that works, then it does reduces the pressure on what has been our singular prescription to any time the immigration word comes up, which is enforcement, enforcement, enforcement.
Dave, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I disagree with a couple of points that Alex made, and I want to take on one thing that Clarissa said. If Alex were right, all of Bangladesh would already be here. There's that differential there for everybody. And migration is a much more complicated phenomenon. The simple push-pull models, I think, do not work. They don't explain the kind of patterns that we have. It's a much more complicated social phenomenon. So, of course, the wage differential makes a difference. But that's not the sole determinant by any means of people's decisions whether or not to migrate. So it's a complicated a set of issues, having to do with social connections, family connections, and decisions that people make. Some people are desperate enough, they may try it no matter what goes on, but others can be influenced, I am convinced, by what the state does, by the legal structure and the legal arrangement that is there. One of them would be if there's a better opportunity for someone that's really reachable in the legal migration system, that's important. I don't discount that. But I think some of the discussion about immigration reform has tended to suggest that the real solution to try to avoid illegal migration in the future is to have a legal path that will satisfy all demand. We will never get there. There will be ceilings. We will not match it. And the other part of it is it's not a static number because it is socially determined. That will rise and fall with other sorts of developments. So we can't have a bill that's all ice cream and no broccoli. We've got to have, it can't be all legal migration, expanded legal migration. If we can get legal migration expanded on something like the level in the Gang of Eight bill, it would be a remarkable accomplishment. But it will not match all of the demand by employers or potential employees. So we're going to have some other measures. And the last part that I would say about that with regard to Alex is, I don't agree that enforcement is futile. It's very hard. It's very difficult in a lot of other, for a lot of reasons. But an awful lot has changed. In my years in government, I have seen remarkable changes in the capacities and the systems that are available now. Now, I don't necessarily predict that we will successfully master that problem at the end of this legislative effort. But I think it's not beyond the reach of policy science to do it, and it has to be the right kind of mix of, yes, enforcement. We're going to have to say no to some people, and we're going to have to make it stick, but also with crafting legal avenues that would at least better address the kinds of pressures we have right now. So I think that's the situation we're facing, and I think it's not impossible.
Sarita, do you want to add to this?
You know, I feel like both Clarissa and David sort of addressed some of the issues I was going to say. I really want to echo what David said around this point around guest worker programs, and just remind us again that, you know, broadening the guest worker programs really do have negative impacts on current workers, which is why the W visa program, the part of it that's so critical is the connection to the labor market needs, like making sure that in fact where workers are being increased actually matches with where there are real labor market needs. I also just want to remind us as we talk about the current broken immigration system, that for so many immigrant workers, they're also confronted with a very broken worker system, like labor laws in this country. And that is not insignificant, and you cannot not talk about that. And so, you know, for most immigrant workers, this is why some of the labor standards and protections and the ability and the right to collectively bargain becomes so critical to ensure these protections are in place. I just want to give a small example. Post-Katrina, when workers fled to the Gulf Coast to help with the rebuilding and the cleanup, there were thousands of immigration enforcement officers. There were 3 labor enforcement officers from the Department of Labor. So, I mean, this is a really big problem. So I just wanted to remind us that these are actually, for us, it's 2 really broken systems here that we need to figure out how they come together and how we find solutions that will actually advance both systems.
And I saw you earlier responding, Al. Do you want to say something else?
Sure. I'd like to say that I'm waiting for some evidence that internal enforcement is effective. That's what I'm waiting for. I'm waiting for evidence that it doesn't create a deeper and worse black market, because after all, we're talking about people's lives, and we're talking about what people are willing to do to get ahead in this country and to go around the law. And by doing a lot of these efforts, we make a lot of that situation worse. Now, about the point about Bangladesh, everyone in Bangladesh would come here. Well, believe it or not, people moving from other countries over here has a wage impact in other countries. So I think that that's a pretty, not really a relevant point, because a lot of people leave other countries and come here. That will tighten the supply of labor in other places. Wages go up. That's sort of how it works. And if you want to talk about the wage impacts of Americans of immigration, it's actually positive. So Giovanni Perry and Ottaviano, and Perry have done a lot of work on this. The impact of low-skilled immigration, because of most immigration to the U.S., a lot of these workers are lower skilled. The impact is to increase the wages of other Americans because they don't compete with very many Americans. It's what economists call labor market complementarities. So what we've seen is the most pessimistic study out there of the impact of low-skilled immigration on American workers is that it has lowered the wages of Americans with less than a high school degree by 4.7% from 1990 to 2006. That's the most pessimistic study you can find in the academic literature on that. What you also see is that the impact of low-skilled immigration on the wages for about 92% of other American workers is slightly positive. And it's slightly positive because they have different skills than the rest of Americans. So while I have no doubt that some low-skilled workers, and there's evidence to support this, do compete with low-skilled immigrants. As a result, you see some lower wages for some Americans in some industries. The massive gain to the vast majority of people is far greater than that, and the gain to the immigrants themselves is also greater than that. And I don't think that we should discount the gains to immigrants who are also new Americans in a lot of ways. We shouldn't hold that as a lower barrier or something we should pay less attention to or something that we should ignore in these types of calculations. That's just what the economic literature says in the peer-reviewed literature. So if there's something more pessimistic, I'd be happy to report it, but that's what it says.
Thank you. At this point, I think we're going to open it up to questions. If anyone has any, we should have a microphone. Oh, there we go. Yeah. Good.
I guess this is the whole panel.
If you could introduce yourself, too.
Oh, sorry. Luke Carmiel. I'm from John Marshall Law School. This is for the whole panel, but I think, Manu, you probably have a better grasp on this. I want to ask you about two members of Congress who, one is Paul Ryan. What's his role in the immigration? It seems like he's going to be used as somehow, somewhere, but it's not really clear because he was with Representative Gutierrez like a month ago in Chicago, but still no idea what his role is. And the other one is Illinois Senator Mark Kirk. He recently voted against the procedural motion to bring the bill to the floor. And in 2010, when he just won a 6-year term, he voted against the DREAM Act. How does that impact moderate Republicans? Oh, I mean, the two that are left, I guess. Well, I mean, the Republicans who would want to support immigration reform.
I can start off with that. On the Kirk element, and from talking to folks who are really monitoring the votes in the Senate, they didn't really expect Kirk to be one of the votes in support of the bill or to proceed, or at the end, the final procedural vote to cut off debate, because he's taken a hard line in the past, as you mentioned, on the DREAM Act and other issues. So even though he's moderate on certain issues like guns and gay rights, he's also pretty hawkish and conservative on immigration. So he's not seen as someone who's in the mix as a possible swing vote as some of the other deal-making Republicans like Tennessee Senator Bob Corker or North Dakota Senator John Hoeven, who are part of this group that's trying to negotiate a separate border package. On the Paul Ryan aspect, his evolution in this issue has certainly been interesting. He has been talking more openly about a comprehensive bill ever since the election, since they saw how poorly they did with Hispanic voters. And he is sort of a liaison to folks who are like the Marco Rubios of the world, who are trying to push a comprehensive bill on the House side, and a very close ally for John Boehner's. Boehner will need, if they want to get this bill through on the House, Boehner will need Paul Ryan to be supportive of a comprehensive bill and be advocating it, because they'll help him insulate him from criticism on the right. And I guess I could open that up to if anyone wants to add to that, as well as, if you want to add to the dynamics also in the House.
I could add one small thing about Paul Ryan. I mean, he challenged anybody to a debate the other day about this bill. He basically said this bill is not, amnesty, which is a swear word amongst a lot of Republicans who are opposed to immigration reform. He said, this bill is not amnesty, I'll debate anybody about it. And that was basically a shot at Heritage, which is, the largest conservative think tank in the world and really has a lot of influence with House Republicans. And basically Heritage wrote a response saying, okay, well, you don't know how to speak English properly. So it's this funny situation where you have an admittedly conservative Republican, Paul Ryan, attempting to give cover to a lot of other people to a lot of other Republicans to be decent on this issue. That's sort of the role that he, I think, is trying to play on this. And I think it's also no surprise that he has perhaps some presidential ambitions. So he's becoming wise on this. But he's been pretty good on this for
Yes,
pretty
he
much his
has.
entire career. He's been very good
right.
on legalization provisions, as well as trying to increase future flows across the board. So
Do you wanna
Yeah,
add about-
I'll
and
like
You
to.
also add about the dynamics in the House as well.
Yeah, so, yeah, I mean, with Ryan, it's not like he found immigration all of a sudden. Back in '06, '07, he was a co-sponsor of the Gutierrez-Flake bill in the House. And I think that he is going to play an incredibly important role in the House, and he's not hiding. He has not been hiding about that. So his role is very important because he is seen among the more conservative wing of the party as one of the lights, right? Whereas I think some folks among those ranks tend to see Boehner more suspiciously. So I think that the trio of Boehner, Cantor, and Ryan is incredibly important. And again, Ryan has made no qualms about his position on immigration and where he hopes to see that go, which I think brings a very important point in that, you know, the shorthand and the way that issues and politics are talked about often devolves into, and I've heard that constantly in the course of the amendments being offered in the Senate and some of the things that are happening in the House, where if somebody does something good, some people say, oh, wow, he's almost like a Democrat. And it just makes me cringe because you know, yeah, maybe I'm more conservative than some, but I think that we know that the fate of immigration debates, good and bad, has been made at the hands of both parties. We've definitely seen Republicans abandon what had been always a bipartisan issue between, 2005 forward. I am very hopeful that the fever breaks and we finally get back to what this issue has always been, which is bipartisan, and for different reasons and different interests, but that's fine, right?
If I could throw this out to the group, if anyone wants to respond. If this, given how increasingly badly Republicans have done with Hispanic voters in the most recent election cycles, if this bill passes, do you think that gap closes in the 14 midterms and the 16 presidential elections?
So the other thing is what's happening in the House, right, before I get to that point. And this, I think, it's posing some severe challenges for the answer to that question, which is, I testified before the House Judiciary on Thursday on a bill that was just introduced there. And I think partly is that the bipartisan group in the House slowed down, and there was a point where they could not reach an agreement, and Labrador left. And then that delay created the opportunity for some of these bills that are going to get marked up next week to emerge. So you can see it two ways. It's either an opportunity for some in the House. If you have a patient who's burning up, they're going to wrap them up in blankets and hope they sweat out the fever, or they're actually going to make things incredibly difficult for Ryan, Boehner, and Cantor if they set the stone. But basically, the bill, one of the two bills they're marking up next week, would actually federalize SB 1070, make that the law of the land, and bring the Sensenbrenner positions back. So it's like Sensenbrenner 2.0 and SB 1070 in one bill with a lot of other provisions. But I think you can anticipate what the reaction is going to be. So going back to your question, without taking fully into account how this alters the conversation, because it's just happening. But I think McCain said it very well. What Senator McCain said is, look, just because we do immigration reform, it doesn't mean that we got the Latino vote, right? What it allows us to do is to remove a major obstacle that has been there and prevented us to have a more meaningful conversation with an electorate that many Republicans think there's a lot of things in common. And so it is politics 101. You can't rest in your laurels. You have to do, candidates matter, positions those candidates take matter, and outreach to the voters you want to get is essential. But right now, you can't even get through the door with the majority of these voters. And last but not least, for the doubters, and a lot of folks in the anti-immigrant movement keep going after Republicans saying, you'll never get Latino voters, they're Democrats. Very offensive, but, to say it's like a minority report, you're already saying how people are gonna be whenever.
Right.
But the other thing is, Governor Bush, as president, he was able to increase his share of the Latino vote, and a lot of that actually came from active outreach to naturalize Latino immigrants, the very people that right now the party seems to be afraid of.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I had a question for
If you
David.
could introduce yourself.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Kara Hartzler. I had a question for David Martin. I've noticed in my work as an immigration lawyer a real disconnect between sometimes very well-intentioned movements on the national level and then how those are implemented by local ICE officials on the local level. And I've cited a lot of your memos to a lot of ICE officers without much success. And obviously, we're seeing this now in the suit that's been brought by the ICE union against DACA, and then some of the ways that ICE attorneys have been called out by circuit court judges. And I'm just wondering how, since enforcement has really been a priority, how do you sort of get, in the wake of immigration reform, the rank and file ICE membership to sort of turn on its heel and go a different direction?
Well, I wish I had an answer to that. That's been a long-standing issue. It's not just in the immigration agencies, but it's probably in a particularly strong form in some parts of immigration agencies. Policy is set, centralized policy is set. It has to translate to the working level, and it's a long, slow process. It's a lot harder when a union digs in against it. The litigation. I'm pretty confident that eventually that litigation will fail, the litigation against DACA. But in the meantime, they found a sympathetic judge who wasn't sure he had jurisdiction, but he thought he'd tell the world what he thought about the actual substantive problem before he figured out whether he had jurisdiction. So anyway, we have we have that kind of an issue. I mean, there have been steps along the way that have been intended for that. I think there are some parts of it that can be done through reasonable design. There was a measure, for example, that was implemented by ICE with regard to release of people who passed credible fear screening in the asylum process. And what was good about that memo, and I think holds some promise for the future if that can be expanded, was it wasn't just, okay, here's the policy. If people can establish identity reasonably, then they can be released. It was a more detailed policy, but then with a follow-up with a worksheet for collecting the right kind of information, a series of procedures for review by supervisors, and a quality control unit. Okay, well, that wasn't one of mine. Yeah, but I think that's the kind of thing that has to be. So it's not enough just to issue broad memos. You have to think through about the way in which it'll be done. So that's going to be a long, difficult process, and it will be a challenge as part of implementation here, but I do think there are ways to make headway on it.
Saw some other hands. Yeah. Later.
Hi, I'm Rocky Chin. I'm from New York, and I guess I have two questions. First of all, I think the ACS, we had a small forum in New York, and I'm sure we've had it in other states. That was hosted with some of the other immigrant rights and minority bar associations. But I think ACS can play a bigger role in this kind of thing and needs to really step up a little bit more to get this information out. I was kind of wondering, and I know this isn't maybe the right group to ask, but to what extent some of the law leaders, the bar association leaders, the deans are taking a position on comprehensive immigration reform. But the question I have is, at that forum, Microsoft expressed, of course, and this was their initiative, they really wanted to have this forum, strong support for LGBT, for the same sex in terms of that. And of course, this is one of the issues that kind of goes also to the question of not just that issue, but also how the coalition is working now in this next week and month coming ahead. There's other issues, the issue of the low-wage workers versus the high-tech workers, the issue of a family preference system and so forth. So maybe you could address some of those dynamics going forward. There's a strong concern that people also in the kind of the grassroots kind of think this is a done deal, and of course it is not a done deal at all. So, you know, that whole issue of getting more of the community issue, more of this issue out in the community is very important.
Sarita, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I can start. I mean, just to say that I think the coalition building has been extraordinarily important in this period. And just to say, there have been leaders in the LGBT movement who clearly have been disappointed around some of the decisions made that would exclude the same-sex provisions that you're referring to, but have actually, again, kept their eyes on the prize of this being a real moment to ensure a pathway to citizenship for the full 11 million. So I think in at least around tables like the Alliance for Citizenship and others, I mean, I think there's key leaders like the National Gay Lesbian Task Force and others who have continued to say, despite that, we're going to stay in this fight, make sure, you know, we come together, which I think is really, has been really important. And, you know, I would just say the low wage versus high skilled, like some of these debates that are happening, I mean, I think one of the main points that low-wage workers are making and groups that represent low-wage workers are making is that we tend to act like high-skilled workers are the only ones who actually like fuel the economy, and that is simply not true. That low-skilled workers are, you know, low-wage workers are really critical to fueling the economy. You know, again, using lines from, you know, domestic workers who say, you know, the work they do makes all other work possible, you know? And so really being careful and thoughtful about how we're not pitting low-wage and high-skilled workers against one another, but understanding that we need all and that we need to actually ensure that this moment creates as much opportunity for, you know, all sectors of workers as possible. I mean, I'm happy to get into more specifics separately, but those are, I mean, just generally, I think that's the take that people have taken. And some of the unions that have represented some high-skilled workers have fundamentally understood that too. And I think there's good discussions in a coalition context taking place right now to make sure that we don't see fissures playing out.
I think you hit on one of the most conceptual, one of the biggest problems of conception that I think a lot of people have when viewing immigration. And that is, it's not, you know, there are a lot of false dichotomies and false choices that are presented to people when it comes to immigration. You know, immigration is not a budget that we need to balance in the long run. We can have both more low and high skilled workers. We can have more family reunification. We can have LGBT family reunification. You know, we can have all of those things. Just because we have more of one category doesn't mean we need to subtract from another category. And that's one of the toughest problems that I have in trying to talk to conservatives and Republicans to try to get them on board is a lot of them see it as a zero sum. They think, oh, well, if we're going to have more high skilled, like Lamar Smith with his bill, he says we need to have more high skilled, that means we need to cancel the diversity visa.
That's right.
And I'm like, excuse me, there's no like, we don't need that. I mean, that's like saying, you know, we have an optimum number of people, so each death needs to be balanced by one birth and vice versa. I mean, that's the same type of logic if you want to have like a family planning policy. But of course, you know, that seems absurd to people. It is absurd. And the same logic applies to all this. So like one of the toughest stuff for me, because, you know, Cato and myself, you know, we're very much in favor of, you know, gay rights and marriage equality and all of those other issues. So having to sort of sit back and listen to a lot of these Republicans, especially like Marco Rubio, say that he's going to walk away from this if there's a gay family reunification provision put into the bill is like very troubling for me. But I think that Sarita is right that we need to keep our eye on the ball. I think those issues are going to be solved in other forums and through other avenues. And I wouldn't want to hold up a legalization for the people here or decrease of opportunities for people to become Americans in the future because of that admittedly very important and troubling issue. But you know, I don't think it's worth to push that to the extent that we would kill the rest of the good stuff in this legislation.
So some other hands. Yeah, right, one over here.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Bronson. I'm a University of Michigan law student, and I'm at DOJ this summer. And I wanted to ask, obviously, this has to be a bipartisan bill, and Clarissa, you've spoken to some of this. What are the buzzwords? How do you advocate on both sides for where there's disagreement? What do you kind of want to keep hitting on? I heard you talk about rule of law, which I feel like is something that can bring people together. Are there other issues that you hit on to get agreement? Or anyone on the panel?
Talk about how do you advocate in dealing with both sides who disagree? You guys want to advocate one way in?
I think the thing that helps me, frankly, is that I'm a pragmatist. I'm not an ideologue. I think that's how I pronounce that. So I find legitimacy in different concerns that people have. Even though, I went through the Reagan legalization, so when people start talking and making crap up about it, I know it's not true, but I try to find the legitimacy in what different people are raising, which is why one of the key things is to figure out where you have people that have legitimate concerns, whether they might be based on fact or on misperception, as opposed to people who are trying to raise things to completely impede progress. And I think some of those folks have become clearer and clearer over the years. It's going to be interesting to see if when we cross the finish line, they decide that, it's going to be easier for them to explain being on the winning side of one of the most momentous votes that the Senate and then hopefully the House will be able to take on this. So again, for me, I am not one of those people who say you cannot do enforcement. To me, the immigration system is like a Jenga puzzle, right? You take one piece out, other pieces are affected. And so enforcement is important. Unfortunately, is the only thing we have been doing. So having a conversation with people about okay, so it's these many billion, where exactly is the gap that you see? Because people just use border enforcement as a talking point. Some of them don't even know what they mean, right? It's just that's what the cool kids are saying for some people. The same thing is true with benefits, right? A lot of people actually, both in the public, and even with that, the American public is in a way more pragmatic place on this issue. And continuing to bring that to members, the fact that there is polling that is not just national, it's local, it's of Republicans, it's of Democrats, and people continue to support this and want them to get to a solution, right? I think that's an important piece because let's face it, as I said at the beginning, it's about as much as politics about substance, and sadly probably more about politics. So people are watching their right flank, their left flank, their voters, what they think their voters think, right? And so to me, it's trying to figure that out and engaging that conversation. On the tax issues, for example, it's a very pragmatic conversation. A lot of people who are concerned on both sides about increasing the complexity of our tax system. So trying to create a two-tier system that is going to treat immigrants and citizens differently is a problem for people who are concerned about tax policy, right?
Yeah.
So that kind of thing.
Can I,
ahead.
I'm sorry, one more thing I just want to add to that. In addition to what Clarissa was saying, I think it's also just really critical that sometimes in DC and in politics, this becomes this policy discussion and the humanity is totally taken out of the picture. So the importance of actually not being a pragmatist in the sense that understanding what the concern is in and really bringing people in with real life stories of what the human impact is of policy decisions is really critical now more than ever. And so, which is, also what's so promising is that more and more we see that happening not only in DC, but at the local level, in districts, that people are actually sharing really compelling stories of what kinds of policy shifts we need and why. So.
I think we have time for one more question. I think that's right over here.
Matt Platkin, I'm from Stanford Law School. Actually, Sarita, that leads right into my question. We've referenced DACA and the Dreamers a little bit, and obviously they've been one of the best examples in recent memory of changing the face of a national movement. And I'm curious what role you think they'll play in doing exactly what you're talking about and getting this bill to pass in both the House and the Senate. And then, in some ways, more importantly, what can we learn from what they've done to apply to some of the other issues you mentioned, Sarita, workers' rights, education?
I'm happy to start off and others can join in. I mean, I think they did in fact they put a face to the issue, which was really important. A very public face, very public stories, the impact on not just them as individuals, but their families, their communities, which was really getting, frankly, to the hearts and minds of the public, which is fundamentally what we need here is we have to break through the hearts and minds of the American public in order to really create the kind of change and the real systemic change that we're talking about. So I think the Dreamers did a beautiful job of that. I think we've learned a lot through their journey, and certainly learned a lot about what we're going to have to figure out, like with DACA. I mean, there were community-based groups that said they opened the doors to help with the paperwork, and there were students out the door, around the block and beyond, and they didn't have the capacity to actually meet the needs. And so I think there's huge system questions that I think they're helping point out and helping us think about. I think their use of stories, their use of just being risk takers in this moment has really fueled a lot of other low-wage workers to talk about what is important. So whether it's day laborers talking about keeping families together, the impact of deportations in communities, or it's domestic workers and guest workers coming forward with their stories, I think it's opened up the ability for people to say, I'm undocumented, and I'm here and I'm part of this debate. I want to be a part of this debate. I know what the solutions are that we need, because frankly, I want to be here and I want to do this work and I want to do it legally. And so I think it created a political opening that I think many more workers have been able to sort of dive into and engage. Maybe I'll just leave it at that for right now, but if others want to add in. But I think they played an enormous role in really opening up the political space in the debate.
Yeah, and I think the only thing I would add is the operative word is not will. It's not about what will they do. They haven't stopped, right?
Exactly.
So
They
from the
continue.
moment that I think they gave face to the undocumented population, 09, 20, it hasn't stopped. I think what it has strengthened now, the push for reform. And one of the things that they have been able to do is something that no other organization should do, which is to make the decision to put people in harm's way. That has to be an individual decision that only somebody who's undocumented is able to make. And I think that they've created a platform for that to happen, and the alliances to try to face the risks that come with that, because there are risks that come with that. But they haven't stopped.
Yep.
I would like to add just one thing, because the Dreamer situation is a very, I think, particular and unique situation in this. And there are some lessons that I think can be learned for applying to the rest of the unlawful population in general, but a lot of them cannot be. And I think part of this is because they are a separate issue, but another one is Mark Krikorian of the Center for Immigration Studies, which is a rabidly anti-immigrant organization in the United States. I think he said it best. He goes, these people are in every sense, except the legal sense, American. So they know better than most of the rest of the unlawful population, how to appeal to Americans, to pull on these heartstrings. They know how to organize. They've grown up here. For most of them, the only country they ever know is the United States. They're American in every way. So they know how to appeal to the electorate in a way that I think a lot of other unlawful immigrant groups and subgroups just haven't had the experience yet of being here to be able to do that effectively. And that's why he thinks that they're basically going to get everything they want, regardless of the rest of immigration reform. And I think this is one of the, handful of issues where I think he's right on. A broken clock is right twice a day. And he's, been right about this issue, because they are Americans in every way except the legal sense, which is, to the minds of a lot of people, probably one of the least important ways.
Well, that about does it. Thank you, panel, for this great discussion.